Hello, this is Morale Bernard with Affair at Styles. Continuation of the story. Last words were that either her sleep was feigned, which I did not believe, or her unconsciousness was induced by artificial means. With this latter idea in my mind, I examined all the coffee cups most carefully, remembering that it was Mrs. Cavendish who had brought Mademoiselle Cynthia her coffee the night before. I took a sample from each cup and had them analyzed with no result. I had counted the cups carefully in the event of one having been removed. 6 persons had taken coffee, and 6 cups were duly found. I had to confess myself mistaken. Then I discovered that I had been guilty of a very grave oversight. Coffee had been brought in for 7 persons, not 6, for Dr. Bauerstein had been there that evening. This changed the face of the whole affair, for there was now 1 cup missing. The servants noticed nothing, since Annie, the housemaid, who took in the coffee, brought in 7 cups, not knowing that Mr. Inglethorpe never drank it, whereas Dorcas, who cleared them away the following morning, found 6 as usual. Or, strictly speaking, she found 5, the 6th being the one found broken in Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. I was confident that the missing cup was that of Mademoiselle Cynthia. I had an additional reason for that belief in the fact that all the cups found contained sugar, which Mademoiselle Cynthia never took in her coffee. My attention was attracted by the story of Annie about some salt on the tray of cocoa, which she took every night to Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. I accordingly secured a sample of that cocoa and sent it to be analyzed. But that had already been done by Dr. Bauerstein, said Lawrence quickly. Not exactly. The analyst was asked by him to report whether strychnine was or was not present. He did not have it tested as I did for a narcotic. For a narcotic? Yes. Here is the analyst's report. Mrs. Cavendish administered a safe but effectual narcotic to both Mrs. Inglethorpe and Mademoiselle Cynthia. And it is possible that she had a mauvaise quart d'humeur in consequence. Imagine her feelings when her mother-in-law is suddenly taken ill and dies, and immediately after she hears the word poison. She has believed that the sleeping draught she administered was perfectly harmless, but there is no doubt that for one terrible moment she must have feared that Mrs. Inglethorpe's death lay at her door. She is seized with panic, and under its influence she hurries downstairs and quickly drops the coffee cups and saucer used by Mademoiselle Cynthia into a larger brass vase, where it is discovered later by Monsieur Lawrence. The remains of the coffee she dare not touch. Too many eyes are upon her. Guess at her relief when strychnine is mentioned, and she discovers that after all the tragedy is not her doing. We are now able to account for the symptoms of strychnine poisoning being so long in making their appearance. A narcotic taken with strychnine will delay the action of the poison for some hours. Poirot paused. Mary looked up at him, the colour slowly rising in her face. All you've said is quite true, Monsieur Poirot. It was the most awful hour of my life. I shall never forget it. But you are wonderful. I understand now. What I meant when I told you that you could safely confess to Papa Poirot, but you would not trust me. I see everything now, said Lawrence. The drug cocoa, taken on top of the poisoned coffee, amply accounts for the delay. Exactly. But was the coffee poisoned, or was it not? We come to a little difficulty here, since Mrs. Inglethorpe never drank it. What? The cry of surprise was universal. No. You will remember my speaking of a stain on the carpet in Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. There were some peculiar points about that stain. It was still damp. It exhaled a strong odour of coffee, and embedded in the nap of the carpet I found some little splinters of china. What had happened was plain to me. For not 2 minutes before I had placed my little case on the table near the window, and the table, tilting up, had deposited it upon the floor on precisely the identical spot. In exactly the same way, Mrs. Inglethorpe had laid down her cup of coffee and reached in her room the night before, and the treacherous table had played her the same trick. What happened next is mere guesswork on my part, but I should say that Mrs. Inglethorpe picked up the broken cup and placed it on the table by the bed. Feeling in need of a stimulant of some kind, she heated up her cocoa and drank it off then and there. Now we are faced with a new problem. We know the cocoa contained no stringent. The coffee was never drunk. Yet the stringent must have been administered between 7 and 9 o'clock that evening. What third medium was there? A medium so suitable for disguising the taste of stringent that it is extraordinary no one has thought of it. Poirot looked round the room, and then answered himself impressively. Her medicine. Do you mean that the murderer introduced astringent into her tonic? I cried. There was no need to introduce it. It was already there in the mixture. The stringent that killed Mrs. Inglethorpe was the identical stringent prescribed by Dr. Wilkins. To make that clear to you, I will read you an extract from a book on dispensing which I found in the dispensary of the Red Cross Hospital at Tadminster. The following prescription has become famous in textbooks. Stringent sulfur, 1 gram. Potash bromide, 3 vis. Aqua add, 3 vis. Fiat mistura. This solution deposits in a few hours the greater part of the stringent salt as an insoluble bromide in transparent crystals. A lady in England lost her life by taking a similar mixture. The precipitated stringent collected at the bottom, and in taking the last dose, she swallowed nearly all of it. Now, there was of course no bromide in Dr. Wilkins' prescription, but you will remember that I mentioned an empty box of bromide powders. 1 or 2 of those powders, introduced into the full bottle of medicine, would effectually precipitate the stringent, as the book describes, and cause it to be taken in the last dose. You will learn later that the person who usually poured out Mrs. Inglethorpe's medicine was always extremely careful not to shake the bottle, but to leave the sediment at the bottom of it undisturbed. Throughout the case, there have been evidences that the tragedy was intended to take place on Monday evening. On that day, Mrs. Inglethorpe's bell wire was nearly cut. And on Monday evening, Mademoiselle Cynthia was spending the night with friends, so that Mrs. Inglethorpe would have been quite alone in the right wing, completely shut off from help of any kind, and would have died in all probability before medical aid could have been summoned. But in a hurry to be in time for the village entertainment, Mrs. Inglethorpe forgot to take her medicine, and the next day she lunched away from home, so that the last and fatal dose was actually taken 24 hours later than had been anticipated by the murderer. And it is owing to that delay that the final proof, the last link of the chain, is now in my hands. Amid breathless excitement, he held out 3 thin strips of paper. A letter in the murderer's own handwriting, Mes Amis. Had it been a little clearer in its terms, it is possible that Mrs. Inglethorpe, warned in time, would have escaped. As it was, she realized her danger, but not the manner of it. In the deathly silence, Poirot pieced together the slips of paper and, clearing his throat, read, Dearest Evelyn, you will be anxious at hearing nothing. It is all right. Only it will be tonight instead of last night. You understand? There's a good time coming once the old woman is dead and out of the way. No one can possibly bring home the crime to me. That idea of yours about the bromides was a stroke of genius. But we must be very circumspect. A false step. Here, my friends, the letter breaks off. Doubtless the writer was interrupted, but there can be no question as to his identity. We all know this handwriting, and a howl that was almost a scream broke the silence. You devil! How did you get it? A chair was overturned. Poirot skipped nimbly aside, a quick movement on his part, and his assailant fell with a crash. Messieurs, madame, said Poirot with a flourish, let me introduce you to the murderer, Mr. Alfred Inglethorpe. Poirot, you old villain, I said. I've half a mind to strangle you. What do you mean by deceiving me as you have done? We were sitting in the library. Several hectic days lay behind us. In the room below, John and Mary were together once more, while Alfred Inglethorpe and Miss Howard were in custody. Now at last I had Poirot myself, and could relieve my still burning curiosity. Poirot did not answer me for a moment, but at last he said, I did not deceive you, mon ami. At most, I permitted you to deceive yourself. Yes, but why? Well, it is difficult to explain. You see, my friend, you have a nature so honest and a countenance so transparent that, enfin, to conceal your feelings, it is impossible. If I had told you my ideas the very first time you saw Mr. Alfred Inglethorpe, that astute gentleman would have, in your so expressive idiom, smelt a rat. And then, bonjour to our chances of catching him. I think that I have more diplomacy than you give me credit for. My friend, besought Poirot, I implore you, do not enrage yourself. Your help has been of the most invaluable. It is but the extremely beautiful nature that you have which made me pause. Well, I grumbled, a little mollified, I still think you might have given me a hint. But I did, my friend. Several hints. You would not take them. Think now. Did I ever say to you that I believed John Cavendish guilty? Did I not, on the contrary, tell you that he would almost certainly be acquitted? Yes, but... And did I not immediately afterwards speak of the difficulty of bringing the murderer to justice? Was it not plain to you that I was speaking of two entirely different persons? No, I said, it was not plain to me. Then again, continued Poirot, at the beginning did I not repeat to you several times that I didn't want Mr. Inglethorpe arrested now? That should have conveyed something to you. Do you mean to say you suspected him as long ago as that? Yes. To begin with, whoever else might benefit by Mrs. Inglethorpe's death, her husband would benefit the most. There was no getting away from that. When I went up to Styles with you that first day, I had no idea as to how the crime had been committed. But from what I knew of Mr. Inglethorpe, I fancy that it would be very hard to find anything to connect him with. When I arrived at the chateau, I realized at once that it was Mrs. Inglethorpe who had burnt the will, and there, by the way, you cannot complain, my friend, for I tried my best to force on you the significance of that bedroom fire in midsummer. Yes, I said impatiently. Go on. Well, my friend, as I say, my views as to Mr. Inglethorpe's guilt were very much shaken. There was in fact so much evidence against him that I was inclined to believe that he had not done it. When did you change your mind? When I found that the more efforts I made to clear him, the more efforts he made to get himself arrested. Then, when I discovered that Inglethorpe had nothing to do with Mrs. Raikes, and that in fact it was John Cavendish who was interested in that quarter, I was quite sure. But why? Well, simply this. If it had been Inglethorpe who was carrying on an intrigue with Mrs. Raikes, his silence was perfectly comprehensible. But when I discovered that it was known all over the village that it was John who was attracted by the farmer's pretty wife, his silence bore quite a different interpretation. It was nonsense to pretend that he was afraid of the scandal, as no possible scandal could attach to him. This attitude of his gave me furiously to think, and I was slowly forced to the conclusion that Alfred Inglethorpe wanted to be arrested. Ebbene, from that moment, I was equally determined that he should not be arrested. Wait a minute. I don't see why he wished to be arrested. Because, mon ami, it is the law of your country that a man once acquitted can never be tried again for the same offence. Ah, but it was clever, his idea. Assuredly he is a man of method. See here. He knew that in his position he was bound to be suspected. So he conceived the exceedingly clever idea of preparing a lot of manufactured evidence against himself. He wished to be arrested. He would then produce this irreproachable alibi, and hey presto, he was safe for life. But I still don't see how he managed to prove his alibi and yet go to the chemist's shop. Poirot stared at me in surprise. Is it possible, my poor friend, you have not yet realized that it was Miss Howard who went to the chemist's shop? Miss Howard, But certainly, who else? It was most easy for her. She is of a good height. Her voice is deep and manly. Moreover, remember, she and Inglethorpe are cousins, and there is a distinct resemblance between them, especially in their gait and bearing. It was simplicity itself. They are a clever pair. I'm still a little fogged as to how exactly the bromide business was done, I remarked. On. I will reconstruct for you as far as possible. I'm inclined to think that Miss Howard was the mastermind in that affair. You remember her once mentioning that her father was a doctor. Possibly she dispensed his medicines for him, or she may have taken the idea from one of the many books lying about when Mademoiselle Cynthia was studying for her exam. Anyway, she was familiar with the fact that the addition of a bromide to a mixture containing stringin would cause the precipitation of the latter. Probably the idea came to her quite suddenly. Mrs. Inglethorpe had a box of bromide powders, which she occasionally took at night. What could be easier than quietly to dissolve one or more of those powders in Mrs. Inglethorpe's large-sized bottle of medicine when it came from Coutts? The risk is practically nil. The tragedy will not take place until nearly a fortnight later. If anyone has seen either of them touching the medicine, they will have forgotten it by that time. Miss Howard will have engineered her quarrel and departed from the house. The lapse of time in her absence will defeat all suspicion. Yes, it was a clever idea, if they had left it alone. It is possible the crime might never have been brought home to them. But they were not satisfied. They tried to be too clever, and that was their undoing. Poirot puffed at his tiny cigarette, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. They arranged a plan to throw suspicion on John Cavendish by buying stringin at the village chemist and signing the register in his handwriting. On Monday, Mrs. Inglethorpe will take the last dose of her medicine. On Monday, therefore, at 6 o'clock, Alfred Inglethorpe arranges to be seen by a number of people at a spot far removed from the village. Miss Howard has previously made up a cock and bull story about him and Mrs. Raikes to account for his holding his tongue afterwards. At 6 o'clock, Miss Howard, disguised as Alfred Inglethorpe, enters the chemist's shop with her story about a dog, obtains the stringin, and writes the name of Alfred Inglethorpe in John's handwriting, which she had previously studied carefully. But, as it will never do if John, too, can prove an alibi, she writes him an anonymous note, still copying his handwriting, which takes him to a remote spot where it is exceedingly unlikely that anyone will see him. So far, all goes well. Miss Howard goes back to Middleham. Alfred Inglethorpe returns to Styles. There is nothing that can compromise him in any way, since it is Miss Howard who has the stringin, which, after all, is only wanted as a blind to throw suspicion on John Cavendish. But now a hitch occurs. Mrs. Inglethorpe does not take her medicine that night. The broken bell, Cynthia's absence, arranged by Inglethorpe through his wife, all these are wasted. And then he makes his slip. Mrs. Inglethorpe is out, and he sits down to write to his accomplice, who he fears may be in a panic at the non-success of their plan. It is probable that Mrs. Ingerthorpe returned earlier than he expected. Caught in the act and somewhat flurried, he hastily shuts and locks his desk. He fears that if he remains in the room, he may have to open it again, and that Mrs. Ingerthorpe might catch sight of the letter before he could snatch it up. So he goes out and walks in the woods, little dreaming that Mrs. Ingerthorpe will open his desk and discover the incriminating document. But this, as we know, is what happened. Mrs. Ingerthorpe reads it and becomes aware of the perfidy of her husband and Evelyn Howard, though unfortunately the sentence about the bromides conveys no warning to her mind. She knows that she's in danger, but is ignorant of where the danger lies. She decides to say nothing to her husband, but sits down and writes to her solicitor, asking him to come on the morrow. And she also determines to destroy immediately the will which she has just made. She keeps the fatal letter. It was to discover that letter then that her husband forced the lock of the dispatch case. Yes, and from the enormous risk he ran, we can see how fully he realized its importance. That letter accepted, there was absolutely nothing to connect him with the crime. There's only one thing I can't make out. Why didn't he destroy it at once when he got hold of it? Because he did not dare take the biggest risk of all, that of keeping it on his own person. I don't understand. Why not join me? Join me for the next episode. Join me for the next video to find out why I don't understand. Join me, Morale Bernard, and please subscribe to the channel and please share the video, but join me for more Affair and Styles. Join me. Look out for the next video coming soon. Okay, bye.